The United States has been hell-bent to dislodge the Islamic Revolution, the anti-imperialist government of Iran, because they are friends with North Korea, with Russia, with China, with Venezuela, with Cuba, with Nicaragua. All of these things have been part of the equation. Now, after October 7th, after an emboldened Zionist project that is now projecting its power, now comes the moment to try to destroy the Iranian government. And we saw the 12-day war. We saw the Zionists and the Americans try to destroy and decapitate Iranian leadership and try to destroy its nuclear program. It failed on both levels. And now, of course, they're humiliated by this because Iran was able to show its overwhelming capabilities with hypersonic missiles, with ballistic missiles, also with drones. All of this to say that Iran remains a thorn in the side of the imperialists, and the West still sees Iran as an enigma that it cannot control. Forget about this Iranian diaspora that constantly complaining and moaning and bitching on social media. They have no power and credibility within Iran. Iranian people who stayed in Iran, who suffered, who went through all of the trials and tribulations, are deeply patriotic. Okay, they might disagree with the government on some things. Of course, there are concerns. Economy is not so good, money is not so good, money is devalued. But people say, wait a minute, you can't impose on us. We will change what we want within, but you can't all of a sudden try to do this from outside. So Iranians now have this rallying around the flag, especially since last year's 12-day war that was imposed on Iran. And many Iranians there are saying, look, we might have our own disagreements, but that's internal. But we're not going to have the Americans and the Israelis come here and dictate to us what we can do and what we can't do. And no former son of the Shah who's never worked a day in his life is going to tell us what to do.
Slavery, then join in the grand industrial band. Would you from misery and hunger be free, and come to your share like a man? There is power in a band of working men. That's some power that must rule in every land. Would you have mansions of gold in the sky and a living shack way out in the back? Would you have wings up in heaven to fly and starve here with rags on your back? There is power in a band of working men. That's a power that must rule in every land. If you had enough of the blood of the lamb, then join the grand industrial band. If you'd rather feast off your own land, then come do your share like a man. There's power in a band of working men. There's power that and join the grand announcement. Then I'll share this earth we shall demand. Come and do your share like a man. There is power. There is power in the band of working men. There is power. There is power that rule in every land. There is power. There's this power that rule in every land.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Escaping the Cave with Dr. Garrido. We have an extremely special guest here today. If you've ever seen the Dos Equis commercials about the most interesting man in the world, the person that they're actually talking about is my friend over here, Chris Helali, someone who's got anywhere in the ballpark of like 6 to 12 master's degrees. He's the international secretary of the ACP. There's not one important credential that this man to my left or to my right, depending on where you're standing, doesn't have. So it's an honor to have him here. He's a distinguished scholar. I've read his scholarly work, and it's top tier. Hopefully, we're going to have a program soon about some of the work that he's done on the Greek Civil War and on the history of his family. But today, he's here to talk to us a little bit about geopolitics. One of the things that his analysis is just you'd really, really struggle to find someone who can measure up to it. We're going to speak a little bit about Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. But anyways, Chris, thank you so much for being here, brother.
Thank you so much for having me, brother. Always a pleasure. And if you're not following this channel, please follow, subscribe, do all those things, and share it with everybody you know and love, even people you don't love and you want to give them a different perspective. Share it.
That's the real Christian spirit. Send the good stuff also to the people.
Exactly. Exactly.
And the same goes for your channel. You're going to start doing a YouTube show.
That's right.
So make sure to subscribe to Chris's channel. I think we're going to be doing the collaboration
Yes.
when this program airs. So it'll be
That's
easy
right.
to find, and it'll also be in the description as well as his other social media platforms. But Chris,
And by the
brother,
way, if you haven't yet, check out the article. I don't know if it's published yet. It still was in print, but check out the article that my brother here and I co-wrote about Hegel and about the situation in the United States. Very interesting for an Iranian journal. Speaking of Iran, for an Iranian journal of philosophy at the University of Tabriz. So make sure you check that out. We'll put the link, I'm sure, in the description to get some traffic. If you're interested in putting on your academic cap and smoking your pipe and putting on your sweater vest, academic, check that out.
Yeah, that was it was an honor to collaborate on that project with you. It was probably some of the most fun I had last year because you know me, you know that what I actually enjoy is sitting down, reading the Germans, writing about it. And when you came to me with this opportunity, I was like, hallelujah. Thank you. It's finally something I could do that I enjoy. This the politics stuff, it's a duty. You know, it's the duty of the militant. But my what I really appreciate, it's the philosophy stuff that very few other people seem to appreciate. So it was really good to have an opportunity to collaborate on that project. But let's start with Iran. It's been a very intense last few weeks. You've had these CIA slash Mossad backed and instigated protests. You've had all sorts of fake leftists in the West, from Cornell West to a million other random academics that I have on my Facebooks whose names I'm not even going to mention, refer to these protests as some sort of revolution, as if Iran didn't have its revolution in 1979. Can you tell us a bit about what is going on? What are the sort of contradictions that led to some of these protests internally? How are they being intensified by foreign Zionist imperialist forces? And how stupid is the reaction that we're seeing from some of these parts of the Western left?
First and foremost, I want to take this opportunity at first to say how disappointed I am once again with the Western left, who once again fall for any sort of USA, CIA, Mossad operation around the world, and then all of a sudden hail it as some democratic project, some project for human rights, women's liberation, you name it. Meanwhile, the root of the matter is that it is a regime change operation hell-bent on destroying the last major country in the region that supports the Palestinians, that supports resistance against imperialism and Zionism and neocolonialism. So there you have it. Felford again award for Cornel West and many others. My brother, Cornel West, who I, of course, had the great pleasure of spending time with at Dartmouth. He's very close to Rabbi Heschel's daughter, Susanna Heschel, who's a professor at Dartmouth and also a member of the World Zionist Congress. So there you go. There you have your liberation and anti-colonialism. But in any case, what we're seeing now is the result of over 4 decades of asymmetric hybrid warfare, economic warfare, siege against the people of Iran. And to take everyone back in time, Iran became an important hotspot in the 1940s because, of course, it had tremendous, vast oil wealth, which the British wanted, but the Soviets were also involved because it was within their sphere of influence. So there was a competition between Stalin and Churchill. Of course, both jointly removed the Shah from power, the first Shah, Reza Shah Pahlavi, of the Pahlavi dynasty. Iran had undergone a transformation in the early 20th century from the Qajars, who were a Turkic monarchy, and created a constitutional reform. But then through a coup, which was launched by Reza Pahlavi, it was then taken over and a new dynasty was initiated. That dynasty eventually was removed from power because he was pro-German, actually, and there was a lot of, concerns about this sort of German influence in the Caucasus and in the Middle East, because that was the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, would also greatly impact oil transfers that were powering the war machines of the British and the Americans by extension. So it could not happen. So he was removed from power. There was sort of like a caretaker government. And then eventually his son was installed after the war, a few years later, to reestablish control and stability. 1953 came around, and you had the democratic election just a few years before of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. And of course, his main thing was nationalization of Iranian oil and petroleum products. At the time, it was under the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later became BP. And of course, the British didn't want to do it. The British didn't have the capabilities to do it by themselves. So they roped in the Americans by telling President Eisenhower at the time, oh, look, it's actually Mohammad Mossadegh is actually a Soviet agent, and this is actually a communist government, which is not true. Even though the Communist Party of Iran was allied with the major Popular Front, Mossadegh himself was not actually Soviet aligned. He was much more of you could say he was much more in the Bandung spirit that would come 2 years later. He was much more non-aligned. Now, he was removed from power in a coup, by the way, that was fomented by popular protests, which now we know from the evidence was totally CIA staged and MI6 staged. He was removed from power. He was placed under house arrest, and there he would spend the rest of his life until he passed. And then the Shah came back with an iron fist, was backed by the Americans now overtly, and they created his intelligence wing, which was the Savak, that brutally repressed. I mean, if you were carrying around a book of Marx, you were going to be tortured and killed and disappeared. Very famous intellectuals, people of all different walks of life who were interested in politics or were interested in diverse opinions, who were interested in anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, even Shia religious narratives about oppression and justice, all of them. So he went after clerics, including Ayatollah Khomeini. He went after poets. He went after, like Gorsoki. He went after many people out there. So in the 1970s, the situation got so bad, and the opulence of the regime was so overwhelming. I mean, people put pictures of half-naked women and say this was Iran. That was not Iran. That was Tehran. That was the city. That was urban life. But rural life looked like it was a feudal society from centuries before. There was still no major electrification of the countryside. the white revolution, which was the land reform, had completely failed. There were major structural inequalities between rural and urban life, and rural life was still very much conservative. By the way, we have these dynamics in many countries today, even in the US. The urban, that's what we call them, the urban elites, the coastal elites. Because, for example, in the US, the coastal elites do not necessarily represent the majority of US society or their leanings. And that's why Midwestern Marx, when you look at this, you understand that there's a different culture and a different way of seeing the world. The same is true in Iran. The people of Tehran saw the world differently because they were in the urban center where most of the wealth was concentrated. The people in the countryside or in the mountains or in the desert or in the forests, in the north, in the Caspian, they didn't necessarily see the world that way. And many of them still wore traditional dress, still wore very conservative clothing. Certainly, of course, there were women who were half-dressed and things like that. But as an Iranian growing up in the US, one of the things that was recounted to me was when the US came, what did they bring? They brought alcohol, cigarettes, and pornography. Those were the things that America gave to Iranian urban life. And those were the values that they instilled. So you can imagine for a conservative society, those are seen as, what's going on here? What's happening? We are a conservative society. What are you up to over here? Promoting all of these, half-naked women everywhere and things like that. People started to get upset. Now, they wouldn't have necessarily been upset as much so if the economic situation were better off for most Iranians. But since they were rubbing it in the face of Iranian people and also having these grand, magnificent, opulent parades and champagne parties and flying in dignitaries and kings and presidents and prime ministers from all over the world to celebrate, for example, the anniversary of Cyrus the Great in the Persian Empire, and the Shah goes there and says, "I am King of Kings, I am Shah and Shah, and I'm here to tell you that your country is in good hands." Yeah, but you spent most of the public treasury on that. Meanwhile, people are starving and can't even get a loaf of bread. So you can understand that people start to get upset. Wait a minute. He's brutally repressing us for speaking out. We are repressed from our religious leaders because they're speaking out. He's using all of the public money for his crown jewels and everything. Like, people show this as if it's something cool. Not everybody in Iran had crown jewels. Okay, 5-6 people had crown jewels. Wonderful. What a progressive society. But how progressive was it when 5-6 people had crown? What kind of thing is this when we're now celebrating in 2026 a monarchy? Wow, how progressive. How progressive. This monarchy was somehow more progressive than an Islamic republic that gave free education, free healthcare, that liberated women in the sense of public. I mean, there was never a woman leader in Iran prior to that in the stature that they have now in government, in the Majlis. That's not to say that there are not problems. That's not to say that there are not issues. Of course, there are issues. Nobody's saying that it's Shangri-La, that it's a utopia. But what we are saying is that under the Islamic Republic, after the 1979 revolution, women gained even more rights and protections under the Islamic Republic and had the opportunity to become some of the most educated women in the entire region. That's a fact. That's a fact. Iranians are the most educated per capita in the entire region. So you had this situation. So to go back, you had this situation. People started to get upset about all of these things. And then you had a repressive apparatus and kept shoving it in the face. By the way, Iran at the time was the 5th largest army in the world. Imagine, United States, Soviet Union, China. I forgot which one was the next one. Then Iran was the 5th. And Iran was developing nuclear capabilities. Had it lasted more, it would have had nuclear. It might have even had its own domestic nuclear weapons program. So eventually, the Shah started to face pushback from the Iranian people. You get into the mid to late 70s, and eventually you have a popular revolution. The revolution, of course, was not just Islamic. It was also socialist, communist, Tudeh Party, Mujahideen Khalq. There were many, many organs, and just popular, like Republican kind of nationalist sentiments all together coalesced. Eventually, the main person became Ayatollah Khomeini, who sort of embodied the spirit of the revolutionary time period. And from that, Iran began its revolutionary process. But Iran underwent a traumatic moment in those early years, much like the Soviet Union. You know from history what happened. The Bolsheviks come to power, and what happens immediately after?
Civil war.
Civil war. So we had a civil war scenario, right? The Reds and the Whites. And we had an invasion by over 20 countries, including the United States, United Kingdom of the Soviet Union. What happens in Iran? Iraq invades Iran.
Right.
And you have the beginning of what becomes an 8-year war that will cost over 1 million lives lost. The use of chemical weapons, the major use of trench warfare. We have not seen that kind of trench warfare at the moment of the Iran-Iraq war since World War I, and probably wouldn't see it until now in Ukraine, where you see it in the trenches in the Donbass. But the Iran-Iraq war becomes an opportunity for the United States to provide arms and weapons to Iran, to Iraq, money to both, so they both could kill each other. And of course, the United States was happy. And you remember the Iran-Contra affair, the fact that they were illicitly selling weapons without congressional knowledge and approval, and then using that money to fund the Contras that were fighting in places like Nicaragua. And so, of course, you start to feel the connection here that's already being said about Latin America and Iran. Well, obviously they're connected because the US also connected them too, right? They pushed them together in that way. And so one of the things that ends up happening is Iran from this moment becomes sort of a pariah state. It becomes, you know, as one commentator said, you had this Ayatollah who lived on garlic and onions and bread, launch a revolution to topple topple the US's most powerful ally in the region. I mean, that was shocking for CIA analysts to look and say, oh my God, this guy is like, he's a bearded man, which by the way, he's very austere looking. Like I saw some comparisons to Sean Connery. I mean, he did have a look about him, right? He had this kind of aura about him. And he embodied much of the feelings and sentiments of the Iranian people. So now you have Iran listed as the main source of evil in the region. Now, fast forward, you had moments of trying to come closer to the US, trying to work for some sort of peace. By the way, Iran supported the United States in 2001 in the invasion of Afghanistan. And you might ask why? Well, because the Taliban were also enemies of Iran, because the Taliban had killed Iranian diplomatic staff in Afghanistan just the prior year before. And Iranians, there's also religious tension between the Taliban, you know, sort of Sunni extremists, Shia Iran, and also the sectarian differences within Afghanistan, who have a Shia Hazara population. And also you have some ethnic tribes in the north, Ahmed Shah Massoud, different things that were going on. And also Iran had a complicated relationship in the 80s with the Soviet Union. At one point, it saw the Soviets as imperialists, then it became kind of friendly towards them. They established diplomatic relations again, and this kind of back and forth. So Iran emerges from the 80s, now having changed leadership. Ayatollah Khomeini passes away. You now have Ayatollah Khamenei, who's been in place since the late 80s into the early 90s, kind of takes the helm and ushers in Iran's next phase. In the 90s, you have sort of a reformist period under Khatami in the mid-90s. And you have at that time Bill Clinton as president, Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State, trying to kind of warm relations. Then you have 2001 with Bush. Everything goes and backtracks. Iran supported U.S. in Afghanistan, also supported U.S. in Iraq, and then, of course, took Iraq because it's majority Shia. So in all of these things, there's been a complicated relationship. But the U.S. has always seen Iran, especially remember the famous speech in the early 2000s by George Bush as part of the axis of evil. Who were the axis of evil, right? Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Well, Iraq now no longer has Saddam. The only two left of that axis of evil are Iran and North Korea. And then of the troika of tyranny of John Bolton, we have Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Venezuela, now they've decapitated Maduro. They're going after Cuba, and eventually Nicaragua is going to be on the docket as well, as it already has been in the past.
Friends, we live under a dictatorship of capital still, which means that in order to keep up the work that we're doing, we need financial contributions. There's many different ways in which you can help us financially. You can become a Patreon at patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. You can buy some of our books, which you can find at midwesternmarx.com/books. You can sign up for my classes and the other classes we offer with our Marxism School, which you can see at the Midwestern Marx selfie page. You can also support my work personally as a writer and everything else that I do through Substack at my Substack page, which is Philosophy in Crisis. In addition, if you want to support the American Communist Party financially, you can also donate to the party at acp.us. If you want to subscribe to the party's journal, which I am the chief editor of, you can do so at redamerica.acp.us. And if you can't support us financially at all, at least help us get our message out there. Share this program on your social media, share it with your friends and family and co-workers, and get it out as far and wide as possible. We thank you dearly.
So all of this to say, fast forward to today, the United States has been hell-bent to dislodge the Islamic revolution, the anti-imperialist government of Iran, because they are friends with North Korea, with Russia, with China, with Venezuela, with Cuba, with Nicaragua. They're supporters of regional allies. The people call them proxies. No, they are their own groups. They're just allies with them, like Hezbollah, like Ansar Allah in Yemen, like in Iraq, PMF and other groups. In Syria, they help to support Bashar al-Assad. So all of these things have been part of the equation. Now after October 7th, after an emboldened Zionist project that is now projecting its power, now comes the moment to try to destroy the Iranian government. And we saw the 12-day war. We saw the Zionists and the Americans try to destroy and decapitate Iranian leadership and try to destroy its nuclear program. It failed on both levels. And now, of course, they're humiliated by this because Iran was able to show its overwhelming capabilities with hypersonic missiles, with ballistic missiles, also with drones. So all of this to say that Iran remains a thorn in the side of the imperialists, especially of the West. And the West still sees Iran as an enigma that it cannot control. Forget about this Iranian diaspora that constantly complaining and moaning and bitching on social media. They have no power and credibility within Iran. Iranian people who stayed in Iran, who suffered, who went through all of the trials and tribulations, are deeply patriotic. Okay, they might disagree with the government on some things. Of course, there are concerns. Economy is not so good, money is not so good, money is devalued. But people say, wait a minute, you can't impose on us. We will change what we want within, but you can't all of a sudden try to do this from outside. So Iranians now have this rallying around the flag, especially since last year's 12-day war that was imposed on Iran. And many Iranians are saying, look, we might have our own disagreements, but that's internal. But we're not going to have the Americans and the Israelis come here and dictate to us what we can do and what we can't do. And no former son of the Shah who's never worked a day in his life is going to tell us what to do. Or Mujahideen Khalq in Albania, Mariam Rajavi, who supported her husband, who supported Saddam Hussein to gas Iranians and to gas Kurds in Iraq. They're not going to trust them either, right? Not to mention killing Shia in Iraq and you name it. So what we've seen over the past few weeks in Iran has been an organized, concerted effort to try once more to try to destroy Iran from within by using CIA and Mossad proxies, be they terrorists, separatists, sectarian strife, you name it, hooligans, local mafia gangs, all of that. And you saw the videos this time around were not peaceful protests. The opposition had AK-47s, shotguns, other machine guns, and weapons that have been smuggled in through the soft border in northern Iraq. And by the way, John Bolton admitted this years ago, that this is what the Americans were doing, funneling weapons through especially the Kurdistan region. So all these groups started killing, and we have thousands of dead security officials and civilians killed by the opposition who wanted to foment this kind of sectarianism. Now, I've gotten a lot of death threats over the past 2-3 weeks from Iranians who have seen my social media and have had all sorts of nice comments about wanting to kill my kids, my family, and all things like that. This is a so-called democratic human rights opposition. But I want to say this. No government in Iran will change by force from outside. It's happened in our history, but it's happened when we've been occupied by the Mongols, when we've been occupied by other major powers, but it will not happen by the United States and by Israel. Iranian population will not allow this to happen. And it will be a humiliation. And Iranians do not like humiliation. We are not a people, we are proud people. 5,000 years of history. So why to be humiliated by the Americans? 250 years they're celebrating this year, 2026, for the semi-centennial, whatever it is. So there's not going to be, there's just no realm of possibility in this way that somehow America's going to, and I think that that's what Donald Trump realized at the last moment. Everybody's telling him, look, sir, it's not going to be so easy. And let me ask you, okay, you killed the Ayatollah. What's going to happen the day after? Who's going to take power? Does anybody have a plan? Nobody has a plan. Nobody likes any, there's no rallying around any sort of opposition figure. It's not like a Lenin scenario where everybody's rallying around a popular leader who's made himself known, who's struggled, who's been imprisoned, who's suffered as a result of that. No, the only people who've suffered are the Iranian people who have been struggling against imperialism, against these economic sanctions, against this blockade, against this terrorism which has been imposed on them, killing of scientists, killing of intellectuals, killing of politicians, killing of military leaders, you know, who, by the way, were protecting minorities in the region.
Mm-hmm.
Who was protecting Christians? Not the Israelis, but Iranians who were fighting against Daesh, who was supported by Israel and US. So these past few weeks, people might be confused. No need to be confused. It's once again an operation to try to destroy the last major anti-Western country in the region, the last major sovereign and independent country that doesn't kowtow to Washington, nor to Brussels, nor to Tel Aviv, but instead is part of the growing multipolar world, is a member of BRICS, is a member of the SCO, is a good ally of Russia and China, is part of the Belt and Road. All of this to say that if the opposition were to take power, they would block China, block Russia, and be a force against those countries and the development of Eurasia and the multipolar world. In that way, we can understand what's happening now as another regime change operation, an attempt to create a pro-Western government in a country that is not pro-Western. And of course, as we've seen, it's failed. The United States didn't attack. And once again, caught with their pants down, they've exposed all of their elements. And Iran is stronger today than it was a few weeks ago.
Oof, that was a masterful response. I hope the people listening have their notebooks and pens out and are taking notes, because that was, you're not going to get an analysis like that anywhere else. I want to ask, because one of the things that I see recurring in the comments of some of these leftoids that have completely gobbled up the propaganda from imperialism, again, because these people don't learn their lessons, is comments and statements from self-proclaimed communist organizations in the region, like the Two-Day Party and a few others. Can you speak a little bit about the contradictions that exist there between the Two-Day Party, which is like the official communist party there, and the Islamic revolutionary process?
Sure, of course. I mean, in the beginning of the revolution, as I said, there was this sort of red-green alliance, they like to say. There was an alliance between communists and Islamists.
That's what they call us on Wikipedia, by the way. That's what they call the ACP. Yeah,
we're a red-green party.
Yeah.
It would have, listen, the problem was over the question of where loyalty lies and where sovereignty lies. So for today, for most Iranians, they saw it as a Moscow-backed party, and that their loyalty wasn't to Tehran, but to Moscow, to whatever the Communist Party, the Soviet Union, would give them for directions. That's what they wanted. And of course, you have to understand that Iranians in that orbit understood what happened in Central Asia and in neighboring Azerbaijan, because those areas traditionally in the Iranian world, in the Persian world, especially Azerbaijan was part of Iran prior to the Russo-Persian wars, they understood the process of state atheism. So now you have Islamists and you have communists. And the communists come in and say, actually, we're allied with you for now. And then the Islamists say, okay, well, what are you going to do after we take power? Are you going to have a state atheism like Soviet Union? Because we don't want that. You had some people like Ali Shariati who tried to synthesize the two and create sort of an Islamic Marxism type thing. So to take the best of the Marxist world, that is critique of capitalism, critique of a lot of questions about labor, questions about value, all these things. Because of course in Islam, there is a sort of nascent Islamic communalism and sort of proto-communism around, for example, interest and loans and things not allowed. Like on loans, I think you're not allowed to take interest, right? So a lot of the things we talk about with Hudson and those kinds of things about debt, it's a big thing in Islam too. That you can't make money off somebody else's misery and hard times, right? So there was a big question, and I think Marxism answered a lot of questions about how to then marry the two, Islamic economic ethics, and also then having a broader appeal at the global economy and how it looks. So a lot of those were integrated into Islamic thinking. And that's why many people who are part of the Islamic revolution also identify as anti-capitalist. Even Khomeini himself declared himself anti-capitalist, right? But also anti-communist because of the state atheism.
Right.
It wasn't, so that was the contradiction. So the contradiction today realized very quickly amongst its big alliance now in overthrowing the Shah, this popular national front overthrowing the Shah, was what comes next? Would it be a secular Iran that was state atheist? Well, a lot of the traditional conservative people didn't want that. And this is one of the contradictions that we see historically around religion and communism and Marxism. And this is part of, I think, what ACP is also reevaluating and thinking about these days. And Midwestern Marx Institute has been very keen on that as well. So in the end, Tudeh helped in the revolution. Afterwards, it then went against the government, the Velayat-e Faqih, sort of the guardianship that was sort of promulgated by Khomeini. And it went against that. It then was openly antagonistic and then started war within. So there was armed clashes between Islamic Revolutionary Guards, the Islamic Revolution, and especially the Tudeh. There were a few other communists as well, some Maoist groups, some other Marxist-Leninist groups that were not aligned with Moscow, some aligned with Beijing, some non-aligned with both. And then there was also the Mujahideen Khalq, which in the early 80s broke and then fled Iran, but they had a lot of martyrs and things like that. But they were an Islamic Marxist synthesis, but they also had a cult around the Rajavis. And so that's a very interesting and historic part of this revolutionary process at that time. Today has no real support inside of Iran. It's a relic of the past. Most of today's members are outside of Iran. Most of them are older, from the generation of the revolution. Very few from before the revolutionary times. Maybe some who are still from the 50s and 60s, but very few from that time, or the 40s even. But most of those people, most of that generation is gone. A lot of them, and I've known some of them over history. Many of them are outside. They live in Sweden, they live in Germany, they live in Denmark, they live in the US, they live in Canada, in other places. But in Iran itself, there are still communists, some of whom are allied with the Islamic Revolution, some of them who are not. And there's also trade union movements and things like that. There's a very, very small sect of like anarchists or these types, but many of them have left Iran. Some of them even fought in neighboring conflicts, especially in Rojava. There were a few Iranian anarchists who went and fought there. But in any case, at this moment, there is no real communist movement on the ground in Iran, because most communists, most Marxist theorists would find themselves in a pragmatic alliance with the Islamic Republic because it's anti-imperialist. If Iran maintains diplomatic relations at the highest levels with every socialist state in the world, then why would you be against it? Iran has an embassy in Havana, in Caracas, in Managua, in Pyongyang, in Beijing, in Vietnam, in Laos, wherever else you want to go, in Belarus, wherever else you want to go, they maintain diplomatic relations. Iran has very good relations in Africa. Iran helped to support the end of apartheid. Iran supported the anti-apartheid activists, and even Iran supports Palestine. So Iran has been a powerful force on all of the sides that is of justice, of good, of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism. So how could anyone say that Iran somehow the government needs to be overthrown for what? For a government to come in that's pro-Western, but simply because women can wear mini skirts and everyone can go watch on Pornhub free at the internet cafe. Now it's good. This is perfect. It's progressive. No. And I think that all true Marxists, by the way, I know some who are in Iran, some of whom are my family members, who come from that background of Islamic Marxist kind of fusion, and they proudly support the government because they say, who shook hands with our leader? Fidel Castro. Who shook hands with our leader? Deng Xiaoping. Who shook hands with our leader? All of these great people, Hugo Chavez with Ahmadinejad, with Ortega, with all. It's just absolutely, I think, very infantile to sit here and to tell Iranian people and the Iranian government that somehow they need to change because they don't have some cultural progressive things. It's a different country, a different civilization. It's just completely different. I don't know what to tell you. Not everybody in the world has the same values and things like that. And we're not going to get into the debate about cultural relativism and this and universalism and what that. I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is securing the safety and the well-being of the Iranian people and the revolutionary process globally. And Iran remains a pivotal aspect and part of that. So if it's part of the emerging multipolar world, if it doesn't find itself aligned with the US and with Israel, well, then it's a friend. At least that's what I think. But maybe other people have different agendas. But like you've said, there have been a lot of people online, self-proclaimed communists, anarchists, socialists, who've said that I'm somehow some jihadist, terrorist supporter, and I'm not a true communist because I support the Islamic Republic. Well, I guess a lot of great other communists also would not be on the list anymore, including
No, all
Phil.
of them.
All of them.
All of them. Yeah, yeah. No one's a real communist, but me, this Westoid professor in the U.S. who has done absolutely nothing. And
Exactly.
that's what's interesting. It's the logic of Trotskyism, which says, oh, you're falling into campism, and it's infantile. But no, what's infantile and what lacks contradiction analysis is your inability to see that the cards have been dealt. The world is divided. There are these camps that do exist, and there's the world that's aligned with Iran, with Venezuela, with the DPRK, with China, with Russia, that represents the pole of anti-imperialism because it stands against U.S. hegemonism and super-imperialism and the global financial system that supports it. And then there's the other world, and you have to make a choice. And if you try to feign neutrality or this abstract third position that you think could exist in your head but that cannot in the real world, what are you doing if not supporting, the principal aspect of the contradiction, which is imperialism, the thing that all these entities are fighting? How can you support Palestine and be against Iran? How can you support China and be against Iran? How can you support African movements against colonialism and be against Iran? I mean, the level of stupidity and cognitive dissonance that you have to have in order to be in that position. And these are the people that call themselves the scholars and the professionals and the real brains. It always reminds me of Lenin's quote, the intellectuals think they're the brains of society, but they're really the shit. And I'm seeing a whole lot of that nowadays. But to connect to a country that's on the other side of the world, but that finds itself in an extremely similar situation, both in terms of the attacks that it has had to endure from U.S. imperialism for decades, the recent escalations of those attacks from U.S. imperialism, and also the presence of these very strange groups that call themselves communist parties, but which nonetheless take these very strange imperialism narrative echoing positions. At least the entity that presents itself as the Communist Party of Venezuela online, which is the old one, because the real one, as we know, is still supportive of Maduro and the Bolivarian revolution. So as far as Venezuela, man, it's been, I think, 15, 16 days since they bombed Caracas and kidnapped the democratically elected president, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, Celia Flores. The Venezuelan population has been on the streets every single day. I'm friends with a lot of these people because I visited twice, and all of my Instagram stories are filled with marches with hundreds of thousands of people. But what is going on in Venezuela? Because very clearly Chavismo is not dead. The whole government structure and revolutionary process is still in motion. They've built this edifice for the revolution that cannot be defeated if you just kidnap one guy, important though he might be and beloved by his people though he might be. But there's a few questions that have surfaced from the beginning. How was something like this capable of being of occurring? Was there treason or something at higher levels of the government? Why does it seem that for some people, I'm still I'm practicing the phenomenological epoche, refraining from judgment on this question. But for some people have argued that there has been some sorts of capitulation by the Delcy government in various areas. I mean, your president just got kidnapped. What's going on? You know, you're coming to Washington and doing these deals, expanding how much oil you're selling to the U.S. Like freeing prisoners from the opposition. I'm sorry if there's something I've always been critical of in a comradely manner of my Venezuelan friends is you have to be infinitely more dictatorial. You can't let these fucking rats keep walking around the streets. They have to be behind bars. And now after your president gets kidnapped, you're going to free some people. So I'm getting mixed signals from the cadre on the floor and even some lower level leadership in the official communication of the state. It looks very positive, but then there's other signals that that represent certain contradictions with the thesis of continuity that perhaps signal at treason or breaks. What do you think is going on? Because it's all very confusing at this point, I think.
Listen, you and I have been in Venezuela. I think you were there last year as well, or the year before. I think as well for the elections and just after. I was there 3 times last year, and also with Jackson as well. We went. I was there for also a period of elections, local elections. One thing is clear, and I met with President Maduro. I had a chance to meet with him. He shared me on an Instagram story. It was very, very nice. But for me, the main thing was Venezuela has now suffered the economic warfare and blockade by the United States. And not only an economic warfare, the actual deployment of a major part of the US naval fleet out off the coast, in the Caribbean to put pressure on Venezuela. And so you had this kind of build up and build up and build up and build up. And eventually you had what then became basically a decapitation strike, which killed upwards of over 100 people, including over 30 Cuban, 32 Cuban security personnel, military officials who were protecting President Maduro. I think this is the highest number of Cuban sort of officials killed since Bay of Pigs, when you think about the kind of violence that was enacted on this Cuban security personnel. And then you have the taking out of these various sites, then the capturing of President Maduro and his wife Celia Flores. They're, basically, middle of the night, taken back to the Iwo Jima and then to the U.S. And then you have Delcy Rodriguez take power, and you have this sort of, okay, we're going to have dialogue, we're going to have this. But what happened in between? Trump said, if you don't play ball, even I'm going to do worse to you than I did to Maduro. And who cares about Delcy? Trump's going to drop a 2,000-pound bomb on her head. Nobody's going to care in the U.S., right? So you have to understand, her father was killed by a U.S.-backed government in
1979, Venezuela,
right? So interesting enough, important year for right? A lot of things happened in that period. So you have her father killed. She grows up with that trauma, and you got to imagine she's now de facto and now de jure leader of Venezuela. What's her responsibility to Venezuelan people? If she understands Trump for having done what he did just to get Maduro and his wife, imagine what Trump would do if she goes against him. He could carpet bomb the whole place. Who cares now? Who's going to speak out? Israel just committed genocide. Now the numbers are almost 500,000 killed.
Yeah.
Nobody cared. Who held them accountable? So imagine you got to imagine, you put yourself in her shoes. And this comes to the pragmatism, because we know we're philosophers. We also like this kind of line of thinking, especially in US philosophy. You can imagine she's got to do some calculus here and say, okay, I'm in charge now of the Venezuelan welfare and the people and the nation. If I go down this path, there's no way to combat the US. Sure, we can defeat them with boots on the ground. Sure, we can bring them into a quagmire. but I'm going to be responsible for the death of 5, 6 million, 10 million Venezuelans if it comes to that. Not to mention the destruction of Venezuela, everything we worked hard to build. So I understand everybody's position. I do, because I've been like you, I've been monitoring it. I have a lot of friends there, people, former ministers, current ministers, and I've been talking to everyone. I've been talking to people here, and everyone says she is literally acting like she has a gun to her head, because she does have a gun to her head.
Yeah.
She has a nuclear trigger next to her head, right? And like I mentioned tonight on our DD Geopolitics stream, just like any victim of domestic abuse and violence in a family, you appease your aggressor. You know, these are the common stories. If you have a drunk dad or, you know, an abusive partner, you appease them to try to not have as severe a punishment, right? You appease them so that they can let their guard down a little bit. So this whole line of thinking, if we see it as sort of a 5D chess scenario, she could be honestly saying, look, I'm preserving the colectivos, I'm preserving the revolution, the Bolivarian revolution still stands, PSUV is still in power, we still have our alliances. However, give the Americans what they want, which is more access to oil, more access to minerals or whatever, but especially the oil. Give them what they want, and we can secure the government for now. Because she knows, everybody knows, we know, that midterm elections are this year, and in 2 years we have a presidential election. So once the next president comes in, they might not have a boner, so to speak, for Venezuela. Chances are, if I'm a Democrat, they're going to go back to Russia. And they're going to say Russia's the big enemy, blah, 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 and they're going to leave Venezuela alone. And then can start the reorganization process again. Because chances are, if they renationalize the oil and the Democrats in power who's not interested in Venezuela, who cares? Plus, they can pivot and say, oh, this is, you know, green solution. We're moving to renewable energy, you know, forget about the oil companies. So maybe she's doing that calculus. I want to give her the benefit of the doubt, because I find it hard to believe that she would give up Maduro, give up on the whole revolutionary process, and be part of the sort of regime change efforts, and now just be basically a steward for U.S. imperialism. I really doubt that. And I doubt that because the entire structure of PSUV is still intact, you know? And I cannot imagine that everybody there, has part of it. So for me, I see this as a tactical move. And we've had these tactical moves before. Listen, people sometimes get all up in a fuss about, for example, Molotov-Ribbentrop, about Soviet alliance with US and UK, the disintegration of the Third International, all of these things. All of these came at particular moments in history that required necessary pragmatism by revolutionary governments in power. So I can understand at this point, so as not to destroy everything that was built. Imagine, they've spent 2+ decades, nearly 3 decades, building this revolutionary society for the US to come and in a month carpet bomb the whole thing and send everybody homeless again, and no shops and no electricity and no water. What good does that do? What good does that do? And who's going to blame them for this, right? You got to imagine who's going to blame them for this, and will they ever have the same legitimacy as they do now? So we got to understand this in that kind of historical context and in that political context that exists right now. Trump is getting what he wants, at least at this moment. He understands that Machado doesn't have that much support within the country. So he's playing ball, and the Venezuelans are playing ball. He's happy. They're happy. They're not necessarily totally happy, but they're happy at least that they've maintained power. They've maintained the government. They've maintained social institutions. They've maintained peace, security, and everything like that. Now the campaign to release Maduro is part of the civil society, as you said, all these demonstrations and rallies in support of President Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and they are now prisoners of war, basically. They are, for all intents and purposes, POWs in the US. And I think that we will continue to campaign for their freedom, as we have campaigned all along. But the main thing is that Venezuela needs to be safeguarded and defended. And that means against US aggression. And I also think that the US is not interested in expanding this war, because it will be very costly for Trump, I think. He's already cost him a lot. And I think that it'll be even more costly. So if they can cut a deal, and listen, to rebuild Venezuela's oil infrastructure, a lot of these oil companies aren't even going to invest to begin with because it's already a quagmire for them. They don't want to get involved. So you see, she's going to buy her time. They're buying their time. And we're just going to kick the ball down the road in this way. So that's why I understand what has happened as a gross violation of Venezuela's sovereignty and territorial integrity, a war crime, no doubt, for the killing of these military and civilian personnel. But it could have been a lot worse. It still could get worse. And our task now is to secure peace for as long as possible, to defend the people of Venezuela and to prevent the US from an aggressive war on the civilian population, on this revolution that could really destabilize not only Venezuela, neighboring Colombia, Brazil. We could see regional sort of instability for decades to come if this were to happen the way some feared it would happen, including myself. I feared that if it were to escalate, it could become a tremendous quagmire for the US, a new Vietnam, like a second Vietnam. And that's even what Maduro said himself, but it has not come to pass in that way. I think Trump got his trophy. He's happy to have Maduro and his wife in a cell, and they can reach some agreement on the oil and let everything go the way it should. So at this moment, certainly there was collaboration. I don't think that everybody at the top collaborated. I think that there was some sort of course, in every society, there are agents, there are those who are fifth column, of course. But I don't think it was all throughout the top. And I think that they are trying to deal with that internally. I won't speculate because I don't think it helps. But in any case, certainly there could have been more done to defend Venezuela. There's been a lot of blaming of, okay, the Russians didn't give us the right equipment. The Venezuelans didn't know how to use the equipment. Somebody shut it off. Somebody didn't give commands. It was, who knows what was going on. At the end of the day, it happened the way it did. Now the question is how to defend it going forward.
That's beautifully put. I think that we have to remember, especially as Marxist-Leninists, that Lenin says very clearly there's times where instead of moving forward, we have to take steps back and try to protect what we have gained. And as you very astutely said, there's been various moments in the history of of the world communist movement where this has had to be done. And those become the pivotal events where, the people who are pragmatic and willing to stick around and see the necessity of some of these compromises follow through, and others leave. One of the interesting things that Delcy did right after everything happened was visit her father's grave, which I thought was a very positive signal, because her father was a badass militant, who was killed and tortured by the CIA. So what sort of wisdom would a man like that give her? And I totally agree. And it's interesting because I think that it's very easy to fall into this game of trying to speculate whether something went down, because I think everyone realizes that, well, you had these people at the coast of your country. You knew something was coming. How can you let it happen? And so everyone begins to speculate about loose ends, right? And it puts us all at a vulnerable position for pictures like the one that was being spread yesterday, I think, of like Delcy shaking the hands of the CIA director. So many people fell for that, and it ended up being a fake picture. And there's so much information that's coming out. I think there was a recent study that for the first time, more of the images coming out of these events are actually artificial intelligence, are actually fake, and they look very fucking real, and they fool a lot of people. But yeah, it seems to be a very pragmatic form of statesmanship that's trying to keep its eye on the prize, not by forgetting what has happened, but by focusing, as you say, on what concretely can be done in this moment. Can the Venezuelans wage a jihad to bring Maduro back? No, they can't.
They can't. They can't. And also, let me ask you: if she did shake his hand, what's the problem? Hugo Chavez shook the hand of Obama, right? Is that bad? It's a normal thing. Okay, he's CIA director. He's one guy. Shake the hand. Okay, big deal. Save everything. Okay, he came to Venezuela. He's gonna. Even if it's true, it's happened many times. Chinese leaders, when every time leaders go to other countries, they shake the hands of the leader, the military attaches, this and that. Big deal. It's diplomacy. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden, oh, I'm not going to shake the hand. You know, at some point, and this is very important, I think, because also I think that we embody this. At some point, Fidel Castro changed his military uniform for a suit and tie. That was a big transition also in Venezuela, in Cuban society, because sure, he remains comandante. Sure, he always has that kind of, but also he's a diplomat. He's a statesman. Statesmen meet with allies, adversaries, future enemies, past enemies. It's just part of the game. It's just part of the world that we live in, you know? For me, I think that there's a lot of purity fetish that we still see, to plug your amazing book and all the good work that you do. But really, I think that people sometimes have to understand that in the world of leaders, they will do it because it's diplomatic. It's the right thing to do. Putin shakes the hand of Trump. Does that mean Putin gives up on the people of the Donbass who've been killed by Trump-supplied weapons? No, but Putin is also at the helm of a nuclear power. So his rationale is, I must be at least cordial with the other nuclear power so we don't destroy the whole planet. What good is it if I'm revolutionary and I'm going to defend the people if the whole world gets destroyed? You know, that's the pragmatism of, and I think the deeper wisdom of Chinese diplomacy, Russian diplomacy, Cuban diplomacy, even. You know, this is part of the equation here. They're not belligerent. Like we gotta get out of the kind of like glorification of violence. And this is something that I have said for a long time. The point is not martyrdom. The point is a struggle for life, for dignity, right? So it's not about dying in a blaze of glory and, you know, being true to your values. Yes, be true to your values, but our values are also the inputs to those values. The context around those values is everyday life. So yes, I have my values, but can I be flexible on some things? Sure, for sure, right? I value human life. It doesn't mean I'm going to go out there and kill everybody. But for example, if I have to shake hands to protect life, will I do it? Sure, even with the enemy, right?
Do you think that part of Trump's agenda in Venezuela is trying to isolate Venezuelan diplomacy with countries like China and Russia?
No doubt. That's been already stated. And that's why Delcy had to come out in the past few days and say it's our right as an independent nation to have friends with whoever we want. And she specifically mentioned Russia and Iran. So absolutely, I think that it's a way to try to isolate them. But Venezuela is going to play the diplomat game. Wait a second, we're an independent country. We can have relations with whoever we want, right? Now the ball's back in the U.S. court. What are you going to do about that? You know, are you going to escalate this just because they have relations? They have diplomatic relations. When she took office, the first three ambassadors she greeted were China, Russia, and Iran that were there, right? In that front, in the national, I think it was the National Assembly. It might have been at the Presidential Palace in Miraflores, but I think it was at the National Assembly. But the first three she greeted were there, right? So you see this kind of give and take. Okay, we will play ball, but also you must respect our rights as a nation, our diplomacy, right? And we'll see what the Trump administration does. At this point, I cannot imagine that there's an appetite for this. There's so much on the table already. I can't imagine that the Trump administration will go to war over the fact that Venezuela still has ties with Russia, China, and Iran.
Do you think they're going to expand the operations in the region to Cuba? Nicaragua hasn't really been on the radar, but you can foresee it being on the radar at some point. But Cuba has definitely. Lindsey Graham was talking in an airplane about, give Cuba a few months, they'll be in the same place. Narco Rubio has come out and said that if he was an official in Havana, he'd be scared at this moment. Do you think they're going to, can they be as bold as they were with the Venezuelan decapitation strikes with Cuba.
They can be even bolder because it's so close to the US. I mean, they can effectively just put a net around the whole island, and who's there nearby to help? You know, it's not like they have the jungles further deeper into South America that they can go into. They're an island nation. So, in effect, they have that at their disadvantage. Of course, Cuba is a very proud nation, and you, as a proud Cuban, would know those deep feelings and that Cuban identity. The problem is that Cuba now is in a very, very bad situation. And I talked to Cuban comrades there. I'm supposed to go in a few months for a conference. We'll see. But right now, their energy supplies were coming from Venezuela. Now, with those dried up, where are they going to come from? Who's going to be able to provide them for them? Cuba
And
has
they're trying to squeeze Mexico to stop providing Cuba with aid.
Correct. So they're going to try to stop everybody from providing Cuba with aid. And the situation in Cuba is, even according to some on the ground, worse than the special period in the 90s, which is hard to think of because it was really bad in the 90s. But they are suffering. They are suffering because the US has imposed a total genocidal blockade on the island. They've tried to cut them off from everything from energy to medicine to fuel, to electricity even. There were some ships that were providing electricity. Those have left. So I think that there's a big concern because Cuba, because of its proximity to the US, is even more vulnerable. 90 miles is not too far off the coast, right? It's not like you have to travel far. And I think that Cuba would be very symbolic for the Trump administration to take if they could. The question is one of the Cuban people. Would the Cuban people ever allow for the United States to come in there and to dictate terms? I think the Cuban people are very proud. I can't imagine that the Cuban people will go down without a fight, and a big fight at that. But what Cuba is capable of is ultimately dependent on the people and their armed forces and their capabilities. Of course, you have the armed forces, you have the committees for the defense of the revolution, right? The CDR. You have all of these kind of neighborhood groups, all of these kind of popular militias. They can be activated and they can defend Cuba. I think that Cuba is a proud country. I don't think that they want to be under the US again. I don't think they want to go back to the years of Batista and the years where they were basically a giant brothel and casino for the Americans to do their dirty business and to plunder the resources and the women of the country. Because that's how it was in the history, and that's how it's seen by Cubans, that period of time. A deeply, I think, traumatic one. And I think one that was deeply humiliating, much like the Chinese suffered, Iranians suffered, many others suffered, Venezuelans suffered, right? So I do think it's a big prize. I do think it's a big prize for the US. But the question is if the Trump administration is ready for body bags on both sides, because a big part of his base are Cubans in Miami, right? These gusanos. But if they start seeing a lot of dead Cubans, that could come as a problem. You know, if you start having massacres and high casualty numbers, that could be a very big problem. I think Trump envisions a very quick operation, take out 2, 3, 4 key leaders. The island falls, everybody's celebrating with roses and things like that, and carnations and everything's wonderful. But I don't think it's going to be like that. I very much doubt it. Having been to Cuba many, many times, having lived there for 3 months, studied at the University of Havana, I can't imagine that the Cubans will take this in any way, but with resistance. They're going to resist it 100%. I think. The question is, at what cost? But I do think Cuba is the weak link here. Part of why I think they did Venezuela is for Cuba.
Right.
I really do. I think that there's a calculation here. And the idea that this triangle has been formed for so long and the first Trump administration was not able to dislodge it, I think now they see the prime time to do it. And they see Russia's busy.
Yeah.
China is also very much more isolated now in terms of some of its long-term projects because of the global instability. So what a great time. Go after Iran to also... So think about it this way. If we think about it in a global perspective, Russia is now fighting an existential war against NATO in Ukraine, right? liberating regions that want to join the Russian Federation. Russia has committed itself fully to the special military operation. Below Russia and to the west of China is Iran. Now you destabilize Iran. First of all, you took Syria away.
Mm-hmm.
Now Russia has to deal with that. Now you want to take Iran away, which both impacts China and Russia. In the meantime, they're talking about Greenland, which is the Arctic, which China and Russia are deeply invested in for the Russian route. Then you have Taiwan and ongoing aggression in the Pacific. Now you go to Latin America and you have the situation in Venezuela. Now you're going to ramp up Cuba, and then who knows, Nicaragua. You see that they're spread thin.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's the hemisphere for the US traditionally, and this kind of Monroe-Donroe doctrine, the question is, does China and Russia have the appetite to really help? And I don't think it's the Soviet Union. I don't think it's Maoist China. I don't think they have the appetite, and I don't think that they could even sell it to their populations necessarily to come to the aid of these countries and to go head to head with the US when already the Russians are fighting the US in Ukraine because the Ukrainian regime is supplied by the US and, with weapons, with funding, with intelligence. And the Chinese are deeply concerned about what's happening off its coast and its surrounding areas. They also have to deal with all of their domestic issues that are pushed by, the CIA is running campaign and MI6 are running campaigns in Chinese to get agents. Can you imagine? So I want to say that now is a very delicate time for the emerging multipolar world. And I think we see a resurgent US hegemony. I don't necessarily think that means that it's not a terminal decline, but I think that the US is giving its kind of last gasps at like full on, full spectrum dominance around the world because it won't last forever. And as you know, the US is suffering from its own internal crises that it has to eventually deal with if it wants to survive as a nation. So I think that Cuba is very much on the board. I think Nicaragua less so at this point, but it could be because Nicaragua is being surrounded as well. Think about it. Panama, El Salvador,
Mm-hmm.
You see around, they're slowly trying to do the encirclements of all these places. It's still domino. It's sort of like, the containment theory from the Cold War. It still kind of has that kind of vibe. So they're trying to encircle many of these places to basically cut them off. What's to happen? I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you.
And they won last year. They won in Bolivia after
Yep.
25 years of Mas. They suffered their first electoral defeat. They won in Honduras. I
Yep.
talked to Dan Kovalik. He says that he thinks some funny business happened, but either way, they did win. So yeah, it's a strange situation where that entity which we thought was on its last legs has emboldened itself in the face of death and has taken some blows and gotten some good hits around the world.
That's right, and that's the real danger here. Is what can that kind of cornered animal do at this
Mhm.
moment? Emboldened with a kind of hubris, because I honestly think Greenland is next. And if the Trump administration does this, the Europeans are powerless. What can they do? Europeans are paper tigers now. They have no sovereignty. Everything they have is from the Americans. The Americans have bases in their own countries. What are they going to do? Large protests at the UN. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, to go to the last section of our discussion, because it's very late where you're at, I believe 3:30, if my math does not mistake me. You're in Moscow, I believe.
That's right.
And that's the subject of the last portion of our conversation. Russia, where is Russia at in terms of the SMO? One of the questions that I've continued to ask the folks that I bring on whenever I ask about Russia is the following. And when the year started, I heard a lot of political analysts say that it would be done by the summer. And then the next year, I heard that it would be done by the summer. And the year after that, by the summer. And I'm not a military specialist, so I hear these specialist guys, that know all the names of the tanks and the planes and all that stuff. And I'm like, it's going to be done by the summer. Russia's winning. It's about to finish. I know Russia's winning. I know that for a fact. But I've stopped saying the date that it's gonna come by, because I can only be wrong so many times listening to some of these people before I actually stop stop repeating what they're saying. But so what's the current state of the war? Realistically, is this a sort of thing that can turn into an explicit war between NATO and Russia? Because so far they've been very careful to keep it as a proxy, and at the level of formal, explicitly said warfare, it's not a war between NATO and Russia, even though de facto it is. How do you see this developing? Is it going in the direction of ending sooner, or can it escalate into a very outright war between NATO and Russia?
The concern is that it could always escalate to an outright war with NATO. But at this point, let's put it in its context. When Russia went in February of 2022, it went in explicitly in a special military operation, which is basically a police action. You can imagine it as a small incursion to try to enact certain changes that were necessary to protect the people of the Donbass. When it didn't go according to plan, Russia then said, okay, we're going to expand this special military operation, and we're going to try to then increase the military pressure. What has then happened is a war of attrition to try to push the Ukrainian state to the point of collapse, to where Russia could achieve its goals of the special military operation by military means. At first, it wanted diplomatic means, and it was very close in Istanbul, as you remember. But Boris Johnson in the UK, was able to destroy that. And so now Russia says we're going to achieve it by military means. But let me be honest about this. I don't have any rosy picture. This war, this special military operation, which you can also consider to be a civil war within Ukraine, which it is. It has been since 2014. This will go on for many, many years. Now, why do I say that? Because even if Russia takes, say hypothetically, within the next 2 years, Russia is able to take Odessa, is able to connect with Prednistrovie, is able to cut off Ukrainian government from all access to the Black Sea, is able to create a very big buffer, and could even take Kiev, right? Or at least one half of Kiev on the bank, the eastern bank of the river. Now the question is, what happens to the rest of Ukraine? And you have to then imagine that whatever government comes next is going to have to integrate nationalists who are irredentist and who will then seek to liberate the territory that Russia was able to win in this special military operation, and whose people want to join the Russian Federation. They will try to liberate them by terroristic means. So you're going to have a bunch of nationalists who are going to try to infiltrate and blow up bridges and put landmines, and you send drones and do suicide bombing, and who knows what they're going to do, and assassinations, and nobody's going to be safe, because now there are millions of Ukrainians all over Europe. And when you go on vacation and next thing you know, some Russian officials at a hotel and they get a bullet in the head, this is going to then happen for years to come. Then you have to ask, what happens if that rump state of Ukraine has a nationalist who then goes to war against Russia, who wants to liberate territory, right? So now the Russians are in a pickle, because if they liberate everything that they want for the special military operation and even go a little bit further to achieve full total, I would say, victory, whatever state is left is going to always have elements that are anti-Russian and against what Russia has achieved. Russia will always then have to deal with a border state that was once part of it, that now becomes a harbor for terrorists, for anti-Russians, for CIA, for MI6, for anybody who hates and wants to do damage to Russia. So in that sense, I think that any serious analyst has no rosy colored glasses for what's to come. What's to come is a protracted period of time of terrorism, of instability in Ukraine, and until a few things happen. Either Ukraine ceases to exist as a state and is divided amongst Russia, amongst Poland, Hungary, and Romania, and there's no more Ukraine. I cannot necessarily foresee that happening in the near term. But if Ukraine descends into a civil war within itself, we could see a division of Ukraine similar to what we saw in Germany in the post-war period, where Russia gets a part of it, then Polish troops get a part of it, then Hungarian troops and Romanian troops. The problem with that is that now Poland and Romania and these countries are in NATO. So
Yes.
that wouldn't be tolerated by the Russians. So then Russia might say, we're going to just have peacekeeping troops all over the country. Now you have Russia at the border again of Poland and things like that. And once again, you have this kind of issue at play. I think that we are going to see the collapse of the line in Ukraine relatively soon. I'm not going to give you a timeline, but at some point it's going to collapse. It just cannot go on forever at this way. It cannot. They're going to decrease the age of conscription. They're going to add women to the front line. But even then, they will not be able to buffer and support their frontline objectives. At some point, Ukraine will have a collapse on some of its lines, and the Russians will push hard and fast into Ukraine. At which point, the Ukrainian government will have to make a choice. Do we negotiate now and stop the Russians as they advance? Or do we just let the chips fall where they may? And will Russia even accept the terms of an agreement at that moment? I don't think so. I think Russians have sacrificed too much and have suffered too much to accept anything less than total victory at this point. Even a Pyrrhic victory will be seen as a defeat and will create social unrest within Russia as well. Because you got to imagine, a lot of people fought in this war, in this special military operation. So you can imagine that some people will be very unhappy, and they're veterans as well. And we saw already one episode like this in the past few years. So if that were to happen again, it would be deeply destabilizing. So I think the Russians understand that they need to go all the way. And I think they will go all the way. The question is what comes the day after, and that I cannot tell you. And I think that anybody who is a good correspondent would tell you that it's not going to be pretty, whatever happens.
Mhm.
Whatever happens, it will not be pretty. And Russia will have the Ukrainian. Russia has now taken the Ukrainian state as its own Afghanistan, Vietnam once more, but not at the level of those conflicts, but certainly at the quagmire that they pose for the
Yeah.
state. And they will always have to deal with it. It will be a problem until it's not anymore. And when it's not anymore, it will either cease to be a state or it will be so run down that it will effectively be a rump state without, like a failed state. It cannot function anymore as a state. Until that point comes, it will remain a major issue for Russia, and it will consume most of its time, energy, and military resources to deal with.
Oof. That's the opposite of rosy picture. Yeah, that's a very bleak picture, but that's where the world is heading, I think,
Yeah.
in all of these important nodes. And what a time to be alive. You know, these are the pains of the birth of a new world. And
Absolutely.
there's a lot of what we're seeing is the birthmarks of the old one still kicking. Thank you so much for joining me, comrade. This has been one of my favorite episodes that I've done.
It's been a pleasure.
I feel like we can even cut the three different topics to episodes of their own because it's been so informative and historical. It's been a real treat. Is there anything you'd like to plug before we get going here? I know it's pretty late over there.
I would just say follow Dr. Carlos over here, my brother. Follow all of his work. Follow Midwestern Marx. Follow ACP. Follow my work. Follow Jackson. Follow Haas. Follow Infrared. Follow all of us because we're all doing good work. We're all brothers in this struggle, and we're all very much together in building this new world and deeply committed to a much more peaceful, just, and liberated world for all. So that's what we're struggling for, and we hope that you will join us in whatever way that you can. So follow all of our work, continue to support us as best you can, and we look forward to continuing to be on this journey with you all until the end.
Beautifully said, brother. Thank you so much for all of those who watched. Make sure to check out Chris's work. I'm going to link all of his relevant accounts in the description to this video. So thank you all. See ya.